Hello and welcome back to NYCFC.com. My name is Kristan Heneage, and today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into two of our latest signings, notably Thiago Andrade and Talles Magno. To help me do that, I'm joined by freelance journalist Euan Marshall, who's based in Sao Paulo. Hi Euan, thanks so much for joining us. How's things?
Yeah, not so bad so far, but bit tricky in Brazil at the moment with the whole pandemic situation, but we keep going.
We do indeed. We'll start with the man that we signed first, Thiago Andrade. Can you tell us what, from you have seen, has kind of stood out about him as a footballer?
Yeah, so Thiago he really hasn't played that much professional football yet. I think that's the big takeaway for this particular player. So I mean, even in Brazil, he's a bit of an unknown quantity. But what we do know, he had I would say about 9 or 10 games for Bahia in the last season that's just finished. He's a kind of reasonably tall forward, but he's quick. He's kind of ideal for those kind of late darting runs into the box, getting on the end of crosses. That's his kind of game. But another aspect of his play that really jumps out is his kind of threat from outside the area. He's got a really nice kind of long shot on him. He's able to generate a lot of power in his right foot. And you can kind of tell by the way he plays that he really kind of fancies himself in those situations, from like shots from distance. He's one of those who he's a lot more likely to kind of take a shot at goal from distance than trying a through ball, playing in a teammate, that sort of thing.
And he obviously joins us from the one-time home of Freddie Adu, Bahia. How has he adjusted to senior football? You mentioned it's been quite a small sample size, but how do you feel he's handled that transition?
Well, so Thiago first, he started his career at Fluminense in Rio, which is they've got a very kind of impressive youth system going on there. A lot of big players that go to Europe have been developed there in recent years. So he comes from good stock in that sense. And what is quite interesting about Thiago's career is that in 2019 he was sold to Portimonense in Portugal, and very quickly he was brought back to Brazil for, as you mentioned, Bahia. And I think Bahia was a kind of ideal stepping stone for him. First of all, it got him back to Brazil, which was obvious that he needed at the time. And after not too long, he managed to break into the first team at the start of this year, actually. And in terms of how he's handled that step up, as I mentioned, it's still a bit unclear because he hasn't played that many games, but he did manage to kind of hold down a relatively stable spot in the first team, and he generated quite a lot of excitement and interest in the Bahia support. So I think there's a lot of promising signs in that regard, but he's very raw. There's a long way to go.
Yeah, you talked about the promise there and the genesis of that talent. When we're looking at that next step, what do you think is going to be so important for him to make that next step and move forward?
Well, the thing is, he's 20 now, turning 21. So at this point, what he really needs is game time. He needs a lot of time on the pitch. He needs a kind of a regular position, a regular starting position in a team that's playing regular football, and that is really what is going to have to be the kind of next step up for him. One aspect that I think he does have to work on is that he's extremely one-footed. But the thing is, he has a lot of kind of pretty good fundamentals going for him. As I mentioned earlier, he's got that kind of wicked shot from outside the box, lots of power. So I'm interested to see how this move pans out, should he get the game time that he needs.
And you talked about those fundamentals. When we look at the fundamentals of MLS, it's fast, it's aggressive, it's got a very clear style in terms of that. As someone that hasn't been able to see a lot of Brazilian top flight football or the culture over there in general, the domestic league, how would you compare the two as they stand right now?
Yeah, it's almost another world, really. Brazilian football is changing. We've got a lot more teams who press higher up the pitch, and the average ground covered per game is it's on its way up gradually. But there's still this legacy of teams defending deep. Defensive lines often kind of play like midway into their own half, and what that does is it stretches the pitch. It makes it a lot bigger, which means that there's a lot more space in between the lines, and so players get a lot of time on the ball, which is something that we don't see in leagues like MLS and a lot of leagues in Europe. And the most common thing, the most common complaint that you get from a lot of Brazilian players who go abroad, perhaps the ones who don't work out as well, is not necessarily this kind of an issue with the aggression or the physical side of the game. It's more about the speed, really, because when you have less time on the ball, you've got to think quicker and quicker. And sometimes these Brazilian players playing in the Brazilian league, they're not completely used to that, so it's something that they have to kind of develop. So that's, I think, maybe the main difference there.
It has been interesting, actually, this off-season. We've seen a number of players come from Brazil, I think, into Miami, signed one at Orlando, obviously picked up Alexandre Pato, incredibly well-known striker. Are you able at all to understand why that is? Are you able to explain to us perhaps why you think there's been an influx of players from Brazil?
Well, personally, I think there are two factors at play here. First of all, I think there's a reputation change for the MLS, because in Brazil, MLS has long had this image of being a kind of like an inferior league with second class players, people going there at the very end of their careers. But this has been changing over the years. People are seeing top players going there at younger ages. People are seeing the performances of the US national team as well improving, and also the public buy-in to the MLS is quite impressive for Brazilians. There's good crowds. The club seem to have developed pretty good strong fan bases, and so it's looked at a lot more promisingly in Brazil. But at the same time, there's a financial aspect to this, because if we think as recent as 2018, for example, $1 was worth about 3 Brazilian reais and let's say about 20 centavos. So that's more or less where Brazilians kind of think it should be. But now it's worth over 5 reais, and that's that's a massive difference, and it's a huge draw for these players, especially a lot of these younger players who are making sure that when they do make that big move, they're making it for good financial reasons as well as footballing reasons.
That leads us nicely on to the other Brazilian player that we acquired recently, and there was certainly a wave of optimism and impact when he joined. Talles Magno, what can you tell me about this guy? Because I feel like I've certainly seen a lot of excitement on social media.
Yeah, he is a very exciting player. He's rangy, he's quite tall, but he's got this kind of delicate first touch and really kind of good tight dribbling skills, and he's really nice to watch because he kind of glides around the pitch. The way that he treats the ball is really quite delicate. It's a pleasure to see him play football when he's on form, and also he's able to get the crowd going, kind of turn a game because he's got all these tricks in his locker. He had a famous one of his first games in Brazil. Actually, he pulled off this quite audacious rainbow flick against an opponent, which basically covered the kind of the news cycle for about 2 weeks afterward. And he's really difficult to kind of pin down for defenders when he's on his game. Can make a real kind of impact for clubs. So yeah, he's a really really exciting player to watch.
And I think one of the things I found most interesting was, he's 6'1", incredibly good carrying the ball, can play a lot of positions as well. If you're sitting in our coach's chair for a second, where do you think he can be most effective on the field? What position is best for him?
Well, so typically he's been played on the left wing, kind of, or pushing down towards the touchline and cutting inside onto his kind of left and right foot, playing in the strikers. And that's where he played when he came on the scene for Vasco. That's where he's played for Brazil's youth side. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's where Ronnie Dyler played him when he made his debut off the bench recently against LA Galaxy. I think he put him on the left. I'm not sure. He didn't get much time anyway. But personally, as you said, he's got quite an interesting skill set, and I personally think there's a bit of a moment of reckoning coming for Talles Magno, because personally, I don't think he's quick enough to play as a kind of out and out winger, a kind of one of those flying up and down wingers. I don't think he quite has that really incisive pace, partially as a result, perhaps, of injuries, which we might come on to soon. And actually, I think his vision, his kind of game awareness, his passing range, I think he might be better suited to playing a bit more centrally, perhaps as like a number 10 or like a kind of second striker, behind the main man. That's where I see his future. Well, we'll see how it goes, but I think that's probably where he's best suited.
Yeah, you touched on those struggles there. I know Vasco da Gama have had quite a difficult year as well. When we're trying to intertwine those two, do you think Vasco's struggles have kind of played off a little bit with Talles' own situation as well?
Yeah, I think so. As you mentioned, they were relegated this year, Vasco, and I think that made a huge, you know, was a huge weight on Talles' decision to leave the club because Vasco is not an easy club to play at. They're one of the biggest teams in Rio de Janeiro, therefore one of the biggest teams in Brazil. So there's always huge pressure on them. They've got a massive fan base, but they're going through some really, really tough times at the moment. And they've become something of a yo-yo club. They were relegated in 2013. They were relegated in 2015, and now again relegated this year. So I think at this point in his career, especially with the stop-start year he had last season, the last thing he needs is to be playing a kind of thankless spell in the second division. So I think he really felt they had to get out. And in many ways, I think that this move to New York is a bit of almost Talles maybe pressing the reset button on his early career. Because I think in the US, well in the MLS, the calendar is probably a lot less brutal than it is in Brazil. Because in Brazil we can play like 3 times a week, that sort of thing. It's the fixture congestion is unreal, and I mean many of the facilities in the MLS clubs, especially at New York City, seem to be better. You'd hope he's going to be receiving the medical support he needs. So from that perspective, I think it's a very interesting move. And also from a personal note, as I'm from Glasgow, I remember Ronnie Dyla as the Celtic manager, and I remember that he's a very kind of fitness forward coach. Over time, that kind of development, that focus on the physical side of his game could do wonders for his career. I think it's a great signing, to be honest.
And we've talked a lot about Talles as a footballer and his career so far. Can you shed any light for our fans on what he's like as a person? Any anecdotes from just him as a character?
Well, he's very well liked by all the teammates from Vasco or from Brazil. He's popular, this kind of smiling young guy who gets on really well with everyone, and he's really nice with the media as well. It comes across as being very genuine, while at the same time being able to kind of have a laugh, and he comes across as a really nice guy. One particular thing which kind of caught the eye with Talles was that when he first broke into the Vasco team, so this is him 16 years old, he first broke into the Vasco team, started training with the professionals and playing with the professionals. His grades in high school went way down. He was really struggling, and it looked like he wasn't going to be able to get his diploma, his high school diploma, which in Brazil you usually get at around 17, sometimes 16. But then after some time in the Vasco squad, he sits down with the club and kind of asks them to build me this high school task force. I'm going to be traveling with the team, training with the team, playing with the team, all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I need to do my studies. I need to pass high school. I need to get my diploma. And he managed to get that earlier this year, which I think it just shows that he's got determination. He's got a good head on his shoulders. Maybe it took him a little bit longer to get that high school diploma, but the effort is there, as it were.
Yeah. All's well that ends well, as they say.
Yeah.
I guess the last question I have for you is, we've talked about the impact that we felt here since the two guys have arrived. Has there been much discourse in Brazil about the fact that these two players have arrived in New York, this big city in America?
Well, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the reputation of MLS in Brazil. Because when we look at the Under-17 World Cup in Brazil, at that time, you had teams like Liverpool sniffing around Talles, a lot of other European sides who were really kind of keen on bringing this guy in. So now for this kind of major young Brazilian prospect to be moving to MLS at this kind of critical point in his career, I think it says a lot about how far the league has come. not least in the kind of perception of the players, but also from the fans, that this wasn't treated as like, oh, unbelievable, he's going to MLS. It was like, right, okay, this is an interesting move for him. It could come off. So yeah, I think that speaks volumes about how the MLS reputation has evolved over the years in Brazil.
Ah, that's great to hear. Euan, it's been a real pleasure talking to you and getting some insight on our new guys. For any of our fans or viewers watching, where can they find more of your work?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Euan Marshall, where you'll be able to read most of the stuff I do. I'm also an editor at an English language Brazilian news site called the Brazilian Report, which is, while we do a bit of sport when it's necessary, it's also like a really good source for anyone looking for news about the kind of mad world of Brazilian politics, business, society, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, you should definitely check that out.
Fantastic. Thanks again for your time.
No problem.